There's a fundamental reality to building technology companies in Australia. We're a population of only 27 million people. The United States has 340 million. If you want to build a truly ambitious software company, the kind that venture capitalists expect to grow 10x, 100x, you can't do it by just selling to Australian customers and companies. But that constraint might actually be our advantage. Every successful Australian tech company follows roughly the same playbook. Build the product here, test it in our market, and then export it overseas. Atlassian, Canva, Safety Culture, they keep a lot of their engineering and R&D in Australia, while their sales teams conquer international markets. The secret to Australian tech success is to treat technology like an export industry. We can build software here, and then we can sell it overseas. I'm Jonathan O'Brien, Editor-in-Chief at Inflection Points, and welcome to the Inflection Points podcast. Today, we're exploring what it would take to transform build here, sell overseas from a survival strategy to a deliberate set of sector-wide policies. Brandon Sheppard, my guest today, is the COO at Instant and has been in Australian tech since 2012, back when major VC funds didn't exist and Canva was just getting started. He's lived the reality of building products in Brisbane while competing for talent against companies offering 3 times the salary in San Francisco. And he's been on the front lines as overseas markets inevitably draw sales teams, marketing departments, and sometimes entire companies away from Australia. Brandon's argument is straightforward. If we want to keep the valuable work, the research and development, the intellectual property, the high-paying engineering jobs, then we need industrial policy designed specifically for tech workers. Not handouts, but smart interventions and policy tweaks that make it easier to build ambitious companies here while acknowledging that we're always going to be selling everywhere else. From the administrative burden that can turn government support into handouts for consultants, to whether policy can actually change culture, this is a conversation about capturing the economic upside of being an engineering nation without trying to become something that we're not. Here is Brandon Sheppard. Brandon Sheppard, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here.
All right, you're at the coalface of things right now. You're the COO at Instant, but you've been in tech since 2012, right? Australian tech, my understanding is, looked pretty different back there. Tell me, what was the first thing in your life that kind of made you want to get into tech?
Yeah, great question. So I was pretty obsessed with tech as a kid. I learned to code when I was really young. I feel like the romanticizing of Silicon Valley was well underway when I was a teenager. And yeah, I really wanted to be a big part of it.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up on the Sunshine Coast, so there wasn't a lot happening there from a tech perspective.
Yeah, I was going to say not quite Silicon Valley, but even back then, moving to Brisbane, what was the tech scene like there, 2012 Brisbane?
Yeah, so it didn't really look anything like Silicon Valley. We didn't have major VC funds in Australia. We didn't have many notable Aussie success stories from a tech perspective. So yeah, really it was the start of the industry. I would say, interestingly, like I got into tech in 2012, but in a lot of ways, I think 2012 was the first year of Aussie tech in a few ways. It's when a lot of the early VC funds were founded, like Blackbird. It's when Canva was founded. I think it's probably underrated how much Canva shaped the Aussie tech industry. I think seeing that success story and a few others from that generation is what attracted the US VCs over originally. And then all of those early investors in Canva ended up being the major VC funds in Australia. So I feel like I started at the very start in a sense. I think older people in tech might not like that I said that. Obviously, there were companies that came before. But that really felt like it was the start of things.
Was moving to Brisbane, like, how did you get involved in the startup scene? What did that scene look like? What kind of people were there? And how did you end up in your first company?
Yeah, so at the time, I probably couldn't have named a single Brisbane-based tech company. Very fixated on what was happening overseas. I finished high school the day after my graduation, day after the after party. I moved to Brisbane and just started networking immediately, going to different meetups and things. The first company I worked with was a company called Neato. Met the founder there shortly after I made it to Brisbane and started definitely scrappy days. Like we were a bootstrap company, hadn't raised any outside capital. Started there as a designer, as an engineer, ended up doing sales pretty quickly. We literally would like pass the hat around. Different people had to do sales. And I guess I was the person who hated it the least. I ended up doing sales for a long time, spending a lot of time doing that. Combining that, I guess my technical background with sales is how I ended up leading product there, which was a wild ride. I worked there for about 8 years. We had our major shareholder was Telstra in the end. They acquired a majority of the company. And yeah, it was definitely one of the success stories out of Brisbane.
So when we're thinking about success stories, your piece is very much about trying to create more Australian success stories, right? What was the moment for you? You know, you came, we've been talking about these ideas, you and I, just over coffees or whatever for a while. But what's the thing in your career that kind of led you to the point where you were like, oh, we actually need to shift some things in Australia. We need a bit of industrial policy for tech workers.
I think probably I came at it from the inside, just being directly exposed to some of the different incentives and programs that already existed. So I wasn't necessarily looking at the industry as a whole and thinking, you know, how can we push this forward? I was more experiencing the incentives and being frustrated with them. I think like every early stage company works with the R&D export grant, for example. And, you know, leading product, a lot of that administrative burden fell on me. And it was really frustrating. It was really hard to kind of stick to it, but it was such a good incentive that you kind of had to do it. And I guess like over time working with that, you start to form opinions on these things. Like you get exposed more and more to these programs from the inside. And it's good that you do get exposed from the inside. It means they're working, right? It means that we're actually taking advantage of them, that companies are taking advantage of them. So I think a lot of the programs are good and effective, but they could definitely be better.
Obviously, tech is now, I think, our third largest sector in the country, and it's growing. And Australia is the only country with net positive US migration, right? We're the only country that takes more Americans than we lose. Are we actually losing the war for tech talent? And what are the risks? What are the stakes here, I suppose, if we're talking about kind of fixing the way we treat tech companies and tech workers in this country?
Yeah, I guess tech talent's part of it. Another part of it is just startup formation and how successful those startups actually are. I think that honestly in Australia we have a lot of disadvantages that we have to compensate for. I think that's why programs like the R&D tax incentive and things like that actually are effective. But yeah, we have, I think, cultural disadvantages. I think that we have economic disadvantages. I mean, the most obvious example would just be the size of our population, the number of businesses here. If you want to build a great B2C or B2B business in Australia, you're not really going to be able to sell your product in Australia necessarily. Like we're a great market to test a product and get to some kind of scale, but eventually you're going to have to go overseas and find customers elsewhere. And so I think there's a natural pull of talent overseas. Like if you're a great salesperson, you're a great marketer in Australia, the company you work for, there's going to be a lot of opportunities to go overseas. There's going to be a lot of opportunities to go to the US. And in my opinion, a salesperson, a marketer is really only as good as the product they're selling. Like you're very limited by that. And so smart marketers, smart salespeople, they look for the best product. You know, a big part of success in that role is finding the right place to work because you can't necessarily control how good the product is yourself. And so that leads a lot of people overseas as well. And so I think we have just built in to our economy generally with tech, we have built in this brain drain that's just inevitably going to happen. And so I think we have to use smart policy to offset that.
I guess there's two things there. One is sort of that the right way to think about this is in terms of firms rather than individuals for a lot of these kind of policy changes, right? You're talking about firm formation. We're talking about kind of keeping firms here, keeping the R&D here. But then the other thing is, the geographic isolation. I'm curious here because we're sort of in tech mostly selling electrons rather than atoms. How does like Australia's geographic isolation, if at all, like impact our ability to interface with the global tech sector?
It's a good point. Like we're selling bits, we're not selling atoms generally. Obviously, a lot of tech companies do sell atoms. But I think in the world of software particularly, we kind of do have an advantage that you can build here. And that's why I advocate in a lot of my writing that Australia should focus on having R&D in Australia. I think that it's actually okay for a lot of the sales force for our companies to be overseas because you need to be where the customer is to sell effectively, to support effectively. But I think building in Australia is really important. I think it's really important to have the IP here. The geographic isolation is probably, given that we're selling bits, less important than things like cultural isolation, which I actually think is a big advantage for us. You know, the fact that working for a US company or honestly, any Australian company that's successful gradually turns into a US company. The fact that there's a lot of cultural continuity through that journey, I think is a really big deal. But yeah, it's a good point. I think around geographic isolation, I'm not sure that it's super important necessarily. It's more just if you're trying to sell to businesses overseas, it's pretty difficult to do that. Like you're eventually going to need to hire people over there. So I'd say like the first couple of years that a company starts, you do have the luxury of just being able to stay local and sell. Yeah, you're going to have a fine time getting started here, but getting over eventually to get to the kind of value that VCs expect. You know, VCs expect you to grow orders of magnitude bigger than your typical company can achieve. Like you just have to go over to the US. You have to go into a new market. And so I think on the sales and marketing side, that's where you start to get that geographic isolation.
We think about having the best salespeople there, picking the best product, because the best salespeople will pick the best product. And so if Australians can make the best product here and then export it out, that's where we end up having these really great Australian powerhouse firms. That's kind of the story here of what we might achieve with the best version of industrial policy for tech workers.
Yeah, I think we should think of software as an export industry, right? Like if you were manufacturing anything in Australia and selling it overseas, you would have sales reps or retailers overseas kind of pushing your product. But you're doing the R&D and the manufacturing or whatever locally. Like I think I kind of think of tech in Australia the same way. Like we're manufacturing the software here. We're doing the R&D here, but we're selling it overseas. And I think that model is generally what's created the biggest success stories in Australia.
So that paints a really good picture, I think, of where we're trying to get to. What is it, I guess, for skeptical listeners, they'll say, well, tech workers are already really well paid. The tech industry is growing. What's the case, I guess, for greater Australian good, for juicing the Australian tech sector?
I think it makes sense to double down on industries that we're strong in. I think certain economies are good at some things and bad at other things. I think in general, it's really hard to compensate for the things that you're just fundamentally not good at, to be honest. And so when you do discover something that you're great at, you should go for it. You should double down on it and make it as profitable as possible, make it as big as possible. I think that we've kind of surprised ourselves somewhat in how successful Aussie tech has been. Like I was saying, when I first started, it was tiny. You know, you didn't really have VCs even, and you would think that's a crucial component to get right. And it kind of just emerged on its own in a lot of ways. And I think it's, you know, we're now the second fastest growing globally for tech. And so I think when you see something working, you should double down and make it work, make it bigger.
Right. It's that idea that, you know, a lot of managers take, which is you spend more on your advantage rather than throwing good after bad money or bad after good money into things that just aren't working.
100%.
Totally. All right. Awesome. And to bring us right up to date, it's only fair, I think, if we're going to talk about tech, to talk about AI a little bit. What, if any, change does AI make for the Australian tech sector?
I think my company, Instant, we're building software around AI, right? We're not building our own models. We're not doing original, I guess, AI research. I think that's probably going to be the typical case in Australia. There's a lot of other companies like us in Australia, companies like Heidi, they're super successful as well, doing something similar. I think it's probably pretty unrealistic to think that there's going to be an Aussie startup that will take on the likes of OpenAI.
Right, we're not going to see a foundational model coming out of Australia probably.
Probably not anytime soon. Like right now, it's extremely expensive to build that technology. And it's actually pretty expensive to use it too. I mean, you see this with a lot of SaaS companies adopting AI and their gross margins compressing quite a bit, which I think is temporary. I think that if you look at how AI has developed even just over the last few years since it's become such a big thing, the cost curve has declined. Like you've seen things get cheaper and more capable at the same time.
Yeah.
Which is what we saw with semiconductors. You know, computers originally were extremely expensive, and you can find so many examples of people from that day saying, well, you know, this is pretty cool, but it's extremely expensive. You're not going to be able to scale this. People don't want to have a mainframe the size of a living room in their business to try and run things. And they were wrong. I mean, I think you have to invest in these things while they're expensive to make them cheaper over time. And I think there's a massive amount of investment happening now that's actually making that happen on its own.
Yeah, and that does seem to be the case when you're actually using the tools and, API calls are going down, sort of the cents per token or what have you, the fractions of cents per token have gone down dramatically over the last 2 years.
Yeah, so when I think of what does this mean for Australian tech, I think it means, well, AI is a disruptive disruptive technology. So a lot of Australian companies are going to get disrupted if they don't adopt AI. I think that a certain amount of disruption is actually good. Like it's good for some of those older companies to kind of have their day but what we want is for Aussie companies to replace them as much as possible, right?
Yep.
But it's also a huge opportunity because some of the companies or most of the companies getting disrupted by AI are foreign companies. So there's opportunity for homegrown companies to take them on. I think that there's a lot of industries right now. I always think of with tech, kind of speaking of the history and starting in 2012, tech is really defined by these major paradigm shifts that come around every 10 or 20 years. And there's smaller shifts within that. Like we talked about the cloud era or the internet era. There's different technologies that come about. And every time that happens, it kind of clears the playing field. Like you get these over 10 years of a certain paradigm, like the internet or the .com era, you get these companies calcify, they get really big, they're the winners. And it's kind of difficult to create a really big company at the end of those cycles. But then when the new cycle kicks in, whether that's, I guess the cycle after that would have been mobile and cloud, all of a sudden it's like, well, if you can build a much more modern version of that works on someone's phone and they don't have to use this, old self-hosted software, then you're going to be able to disrupt that company. And big calcified companies move slow. So it's a golden opportunity to do that. I think a lot of people in tech are kind of waiting for those paradigm shifts to happen in their career. I definitely was. Like I got into tech at the end of that paradigm. And so we kind of were working with scraps a little bit, but AI, I think, is obviously the paradigm shift of our lifetimes, right? And with that is going to be a lot of disruption for a lot of companies. So companies that seemed untouchable 2 years ago are very, very under threat. And you see this is why every big company is investing in AI, whether they're acquiring companies that are building competitors or trying to sticky tape AI on top of their products. So I think it's a golden opportunity. I think during these times we should invest. I think that honestly Australia isn't going to compete in a lot of parts of AI, which is actually a good thing. I don't even know if we should try, to be honest. I think we can use the capital that we have to invest in disrupting those companies instead, which I think is probably better ROI for an economy like ours.
Yeah, so really what we're kind of landing on is that there's like massive upside here. But the upside is actually in using AI as a tool to disrupt competitors who might be local, might be global. But the new Australian companies have this real opportunity to kind of capture that upside.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely opportunity for research in Australia too. I think one thing that's really compelling or interesting to economies like ours would be, what can we discover ways to bring that cost down, especially on the building of models? Because in the long run, it's going to be like a lot of the things we talk about today geopolitically. Like there's going to be a geopolitical risk to not having our own AI, but I'm just not sure that we can actually solve that right now. I'd be focusing on the economic benefits for now and kind of letting the other countries invent ways to bring that cost curve down and let us kind of catch up a bit later.
Yeah, we can do what we've done with many, many technologies, including, say, solar panels, which is ride on other people's research and become, one of the best in the world at installing the actual thing.
Well, solar panels, I mean, the cost there has been brought down by China.
Yep.
And with DeepSeek, China's demonstrated they can do exactly the same thing in AI. So, small countries like Australia investing huge amounts of money in building models in the most expensive way possible when there are technologies coming out that will halve or, reduce the cost of that by 99% over the next couple of years. It just seems like a waste right now. I think there's so much short-term opportunity while everyone's distracted by the big picture. I think there's a lot of opportunity right now to actually build innovative, disruptive software companies on top of AI instead.
And that's really where we can come back to the article itself. You kind of cover 5 areas of policy, which I'll rattle off quickly for the listener. So research and development incentives, which of course we've talked about a little bit, that should be simple to claim and aligned to iterative product work. Broad employee ownership that turns staff into partners. So we're looking at employee share options, reworking how that works, an angel market that seeds the next generation, so taking people who've been successful in the field and keeping their capital here, investing in new companies. Talent that can move quickly to the team's shipping value, and then, of course, a pipeline that brings great engineers to Australia and grows more of our own. I'm going to let you pick where we start by asking if we could just do one of these tranches, focus on one of these 5 things that your essay goes into. Which intervention do you have a hunch would make the biggest difference?
I think it's hard to pick one. I would like to pick 2 maybe.
I'll allow it.
So I think I want to pick one for companies and one for talent. So on the company side, I really think that we're leaving a lot on the table with our current approach to the R&D tax incentive. I think that a simplified R&D tax incentive would attract way more startup formation, and it would distract our companies a lot less. I think that it's a really great scheme when you look at it from an economic perspective, like companies being able to claim back, 43% of what they're spending in research and development, which is for any innovative company the biggest cost center that they have. That's really compelling, and it's extremely competitive internationally. I think what frustrates a lot of founders that I talk to is when you look at these incentives, they're clearly set up to benefit software companies. They're handouts to software companies, right? But they also feel equally handouts to lawyers and accountants and consultants who you need to bring in just to comply with these schemes. And I feel like a radical simplification of them would allow startups to just focus on building. I think what we know is that the most successful startups are successful because they're focused. They know what they're doing, they keep their eye on the ball, and they build something really ambitious with insane urgency. And it's really hard to do that with any amount of administrational burden. I think that obviously there's a degree of that that's inevitable and that's just part of doing business. But I think when a government program's designed, we should be looking at how do we reduce the complexity? How do we make it so that we're not actually adding that much more burden onto the companies? Because for a lot of these companies, the amount that they're spending on compliance with these programs, it significantly offsets what they're getting back. And so it turns, like I said, it turns an incentive for tech companies into essentially, I think, more support for consultants and accountants and lawyers who have to support those programs.
Right. And if you're getting sort of, roughly 43% back, then technically anything up to 42.99% spent on consultants and whatnot is still a solid deal, which just means that, there's a lot of room for kind of the complexity to, I guess, quote unquote, be absorbed, but it still is a massive cost to the company itself operationally.
Well, and the biggest problem of all is the opportunity cost. It's the distraction of the leadership team to have to actually think about like, oh, am I compliant with this? Like, how do I think about this? How do I maximize my participation in this program?
Absolutely. And so simplifying that and simplifying regulation kind of generally, especially for early stage companies without, teams of lawyers and whatnot, feels kind of like a no-brainer.
Absolutely, which actually is connected to my second choice for employees is the way we do employee share ownership plans. So employee share ownership plans are such an important part of what has made any tech ecosystem successful. It's the cornerstone of Silicon Valley, this idea that you're building something big, you're building something ambitious. It's a small company. You might not be getting the best salary for the first few years. You're taking a pretty big career risk and you're going to be working a lot. They're very intense environments. The payoff is the fact that you get to own a piece of that company. And you hear all these stories about people who, they could be relatively small contributions. They could be people they just joined early, worked really hard, and they managed to actually turn that into, a pretty huge outcome for them financially, which is great. And I think that reward, it does a lot of things. It's important, I think, for employee compensation, for one. I think it also creates a culture in the industry that's really important. I think it actually attracts risk takers into startups, which is really important for startup success. I think that's actually an underrated component of it, like not just the financial benefit, but just the fact that, in a startup, you're doing something ambitious, you're taking risks. You want people who look at a low income, an insane amount of work, but the ability to potentially turn their share ownership into a massive outcome for them to be attracted to that. You want to attract those people into that industry because that's essentially what startups are doing. Startups are taking very small budgets and an insane amount of work and turning it into massive outcomes. So I think that ESOP is really important, that employees share ownership. And I think it's an obvious kind of area where, just like with the R&D export grants, it feels like so much of what has been done by the government is really just going to accountants and lawyers who are setting that up for you, right? It's very complicated. And they've put in efforts, just like how the R&D Export Grant is a good program. Like we're kind of nitpicking on this, to be honest. Like we're very lucky to have such a generous program. Kind of similar with ESOP, where the government has tried to simplify it. They have actually significantly improved it over the last few years. But what they've left us with is kind of like two okay options. There's no like single great pathway to go down.
I want to touch on one of the more controversial sections of the essay, which is where you talk about talent mobility between companies. We call it reducing restructuring costs, but really basically it's about making it easier to fire people. And I think that's something that Australians aren't sort of naturally comfortable with. It's pretty hard to fire people in this country. And I would love for you to run through kind of where that importance is, why it's particularly important in early stage companies, and how it kind of compares. You've obviously got a lot of business experience over in the US as well.
Yeah, so for me, it's not just about like I run a company and I wish I could fire people more easily or anything like that. I think it's just about having liquidity in the talent market is maybe a crass way to put it, but I just think it's really important in a market for the right people to end up in the right place. I think that this actually benefits employees themselves as well. There's research to show that people actually earn more in markets with more talent mobility. I think that in any market, when you're kind of locking something down and making it more rigid or difficult to reallocate resources, it does create a lot of inefficiency. I think, for example, one way that this helps employees, or one way to look at it from an employee perspective, is historically Australia has had company-friendly enforcement of non-compete agreements. And I think that's actually been a huge reason. You hear this all the time in the US, where non-competes are rapidly getting essentially banned. A big part of the success of Silicon Valley is the fact that, honestly, if you're working at a company, building a product, and you realize you lose faith in the leadership, you lose faith in the direction of the product, you can leave and start a competitor immediately. And I think that's a form of, I guess, talent liquidity. If you have a contract that says you can't do that, well, you zoom out a little bit, the economy, the country just missed out on a great innovative company being formed. And I think it's similar on the other side. Like if you're a early stage startup, it's really hard to work out what you actually need in those early days. I think the government has actually recognized that already. Like there are exemptions to some of our rules around dismissal and when you have to kind of make the decision. Like the system in Australia is essentially that once someone's passed their probation, they're kind of locked in as an employee. And there are exceptions to that for small companies, but the criteria for a small company is it only really covers companies with less than 15 staff. A lot of venture-backed companies will cross that in the first couple of months of the company. So it doesn't really help them at all. I think extending that just a little bit, increasing that quota to 50 or so employees would just give startup founders more time to find the right team, more time to realize what they need and kind of build that team out. And also just acknowledge the fact that in the first year or two of any startup, what they need actually does change. Like the people who get you to your first $1 million in revenue are often not the people who will get you to your first $10 million in revenue. And I think having that dynamism within the talent space is just super important for startups. I don't think it's one of those things startup founders don't really feel comfortable talking about, which makes sense. But I do hear kind of off the record a lot from people who, they get their first taste of hiring over in the US or hiring in Asia, and they realize, oh wait, there's actually a huge benefit in the fact that I can give someone a try and I don't have to make up my mind in the first 6 months. Like I can actually, it takes a while to build pipeline if you're doing enterprise sales, for example. I can actually give them a bit longer to work it out. Yeah, and I think it's very attractive, I guess, when you get a taste of that. And I think a lot of companies end up concentrating their resources, even if maybe it's a little subconscious, over in the US instead.
Gotcha, just because the incentive is there just slightly. I know there's a stat in your article that, restructuring costs in the US are in the order of months, whereas in the EU, it can end up being in the magnitude of years.
Yeah, and I think just what it all comes down to for me is just people moving around and finding the right place for them is good. Like, it's good for the employee and it's good for the company. And I think a lot of those metrics, a lot of those studies that are referenced in the piece show that it's actually good for the economy too, if you zoom out.
Yeah, and this brings me to like a neat little transition too, as we sort of move toward talking a little bit about culture. But there are trade-offs here, right? A lot of people would say, well, especially looking now, we don't want to be anything like America, right? We don't want to be like Silicon Valley. We'd rather not have a super tech sector if it means we're more like America, for instance. But on the other hand, we don't necessarily want to be Europe either. We kind of want to be like Australia. But if we want to be like Australia, we can't just be stagnant, right? We need to change somehow because the future keeps moving forward. Is thinking about it as becoming more like Europe or more like America too crude a framing here in terms of like the directions that are before us? Or is there really like a unique Australian direction that we should be talking about?
I think there's a unique Australian direction. I think that if you have a big problem with, US big tech, for example, which I think is where a lot of this comes from, a country like Australia is not really going to assert a lot of control over big tech. But having our own competitive big tech companies here would only be a good thing, right? Like, very successful, powerful technology companies that are born out of Australian culture and Australian ideals would be a counterbalance to some of the problems that people have with US culture or US technology culture.
And that kind of brings us to, I think, the culture, right? You said that sort of Australians, as they move over to the US, export some Australian culture, and it sort of runs through the company a little bit, even though you're selling over in a different country. What does that look like? What are the bits of Australian culture that get taken overseas?
It's interesting because I think in general in tech, you kind of attract the most American people in Australia, in a sense.
Okay.
I think Australia is kind of cursed by tall poppy syndrome, and tech can be a bit of a refuge from that, to be honest. Tech is one of those areas, one of those industries that people know that, you can be there, you can achieve big things, and that great achievements are actually generally respected. And I think different industries through different eras are like this, like finance used to be this, but, ambitious people go to specific industries. And I think right now tech, and for a while it has been tech. And so you get a bit of a different culture in tech compared to the rest of Australia, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not held back by tall poppy syndrome or some of these other characteristics of Australian culture.
Right. Tech is less tall poppy than the rest of Australia, but maybe not no tall poppy.
I would say an American with an objectively terrible idea talks about it more and is more confident about it than a lot of Australian founders I've met with amazing ideas that they've actually built and they're starting to sell.
When I was over in the States, I was walking around SF and was walking around Salesforce Park, actually, and ended up kind of trailing this conversation between these two guys, arguing about whether they were making Uber for musicians or whether they were making Tinder for musicians. The answer is either way, it had a total addressable market of like 12 guys. But yeah, that is exactly right. Like, these guys were talking about like leaving, I think, a job at Salesforce in sales to like do this like tech company that, as far as I could tell, was like, yeah, 12 musicians would possibly ever use this app.
And if you overheard the Airbnb founders describing their idea before that company took off, you would have thought similar things, right?
Totally.
I think it's the confidence and the individualism that comes with America just naturally comes to Americans. That is the reason why they have so many successful companies. And I think a lot of those ideas, maybe they actually wouldn't come out of Australia. Like maybe the ideas behind Australian startups are a little more obvious, a little less risky as a result.
Yeah, maybe. I'm curious about if Australian tech kind of has a little bit less tall poppy. Is there a way that you can kind of see the tech potentially exporting that to other areas of Australian culture or the Australian economy? And is there a way to do that? And do we want that to happen?
I think tall poppy is really downstream from the fact, or a component of the fact, that we have a very egalitarian culture in Australia. I think that generally when people cut down the tall poppies, their heart is actually in the right place and they're kind of doing it for the right reasons. Like, I think we culturally have an allergy to the arrogance that comes with success. And generally when you see tall poppy, that's what people are trying to get at. It's like, you might be successful, but we're all still pretty much equal, is generally, I think, the way people think about it. And I think that's actually a really good and admirable part of Aussie culture. I think it's pretty remarkable, actually, when you compare to other countries, how little there is a class divide in Australia, especially given that, the country's rooted in a lot of class disparities, even from, like, you compare the fact that so many Australians are descended from convicts, and you don't know who was descended from a convict, do you?
No.
You don't. I think that has been that cultural component has actually broken down a lot of the class structures that originated in a lot of the cultures that we came from as Australians. But yeah, I'm not sure how much you want to change that. I think that I think that you want to encourage people to do big things. I think where the allergy to the arrogance that comes with success goes bad is when it starts getting triggered by just success itself, and you start trying to cut people down just because they're trying something or before they've even succeeded in the first place. I think, like, people can think of ambition as being arrogant, which I don't really think it typically is. And I think it probably is important to try and reduce it outside of tech, because everyone is outside of tech before they get into tech, right? And if we have this, like, prevailing culture of, hey, people who want to do ambitious things and have big ideas, need to be discouraged, I think that just will actually just stop people from jumping into tech in the first place.
Right. I think that's a good way of conceptualizing the tall poppy kind of phenomenon, which is, mistaking ambition for arrogance. And if we can avoid that, that's probably quite a good thing. Do you think policy changes, say, that make it easier to do more ambitious things, let's say, similar to kind of what you've laid out in your essay, but also, there's any number of other things we could do to make, company formation easier, nonprofit formation easier. Do you think there's any sum of policy changes that would shift culture, or do you really think that, like, the policy changes come downstream? Like, let's say we implement all your stuff, and then let's say we juiced it and became even more radically open and easier to form companies here in Australia than in Silicon Valley. Do you think we'd end up with, like, a fundamentally different Australia, or do you think we would just filter in and build the Australian version within sort of looser parameters?
I think people are encouraged to do what they see, right? So I think if there are more successful founders, successful companies, then younger people especially are going to be more encouraged to try and do something similar and kind of overcome the tall poppy experience a bit. And so I think really probably the best thing to do from a policy perspective is just make sure there are more success stories, make sure that there are more positive role models for people who want to do something ambitious, that they can actually see, well, this person did it, they're not an idiot, maybe I can do it too.
And so it's 2035, it's been 10 years, your vision succeeded, Australian tech is booming. What would it look like? What specific things do you think would be different in the country or in the sector?
Yeah, I think success in 10 years is probably many more companies, much bigger engineering workforces in particular. A lot more companies following this model of building here, selling overseas. I think seeing Australian IP having a lot of influence internationally would be a big measure of success, or a big sign that we're doing things right. And for the tech industry to just be an even larger component of our economy. I mean, we're eventually going to have to find alternatives to fossil fuels and the big industries that kind of power the economy currently. I think tech is probably our best option. And so seeing that start to show, seeing our industry start to take over that share of GDP would be really encouraging, that we are actually going to make it into the next century, make it into the next millennium, and what's ahead of us across the world.
And as always, final question. What's one thing about how Australia works that you think more people should know?
Okay, this one's maybe it's an urban legend, maybe it's true. I've never fact checked it myself, but apparently New Zealand is actually listed as a state in our constitution. I think when they federated the country, they weren't sure if New Zealand would want to join or not, and to save the burden of having to pass the constitution again or amend the constitution, they decided to just chuck them in just in case they wanted to join as a state.
That's right. They can join anytime. So rather than it being an answer, and I will accept the answer, but it's an answer not about how Australia works, but how it might one day. And New Zealand listeners, take heed. Well, you're welcome anytime. 30% of New Zealanders under 30 live in Australia anyway. So, practically speaking, what's the difference? Folks, thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Brandon, for being here. And thank you so much for your article.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Inflection Points podcast, a production of Inflection Points Publishing, including me, Jonathan O'Brien, as well as Ethan Gilbert and Manning Clifford. Our music is by Isha Ramdas, who also provides additional engineering support. Thank you for listening. We'll talk to you soon.